Today we're going to be checking out the 405V, seeing how it compares against its sister, the 405M, and seeing if it's worth your money for PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation. Now, one of the first things to say about the RG405V is just how much it stands out. Yes, it's a vertical console, and we've had vertical consoles aplenty, especially with analog sticks, but we haven't had one quite like this yet. The width and size of the RG405V makes it stand head and shoulders above all other vertical consoles that we've seen to date, making it truly unique and a one-of-a-kind in the market. I think we really need to take our hats off to Anbernic for producing a console like this, because Anbernic have kind of been criticized over the past year or two for just banging out generic consoles, kind of copying other ideas, but this time they've really gone and created something special and unique. Now, as you can see, I've gone for the wooden variant, and I've always been on the fence about wooden style consoles. I've always wanted one, but never finally pulled the trigger, but this time it had to be the case with the RG405V, and I think it looks absolutely stunning in the wooden effect. Now, the thing to know about the RG405V versus the 405M is that they are identical consoles in their hardware, with the exception of the battery. The 405M bangs out around about 7 hours of battery life, while the 405V bangs out 9 hours. But equally, it takes you 2 hours to fully charge a 405M and 3 hours to fully charge a 405V. Other than that, and physical form aside, these two consoles are identical, and therefore should provide the same user experience and emulation experience as each other, and in my tests they do. If you want to do a direct comparison between the 405V and the 405M or any other retro handheld console, then you can check out the Chronic Spartan comparison tool. Pushing both these consoles to the limits and testing both GameCube and PlayStation 2 games, both of them performed pretty much identically for every game covered. So the difference between the 405M and the 405V is that the 405M is a sideways console that's made out of a metallic shell, which feels amazing, and the 405V is a vertical console made out of a plastic shell, but still has that same amazing Anbernic quality we've come to know and love. What I really love about the 405V is that Anbernic have taken their quality to the next level and paid so much attention to detail. Vertical consoles aren't always the most comfortable to play, especially when you're dealing with PlayStation 1, Dreamcast games, and especially PS2 and GameCube. But with the extra surface area that Anbernic have got with the 405V, they have really gone to town on making this potentially one of the most comfortable retro gaming handhelds I've ever used. Put it into context, I almost always pick landscape over vertical, but the 405V has me questioning my choices now. With chunky shoulders on the back that let you get your hands around it like you would a PS2 controller, perfectly angled and sloped shoulder buttons as well, where your fingers just naturally sit there, you don't even have to try and put them in place, and even little tiny cutouts near the bottom where your pinky fingers can sit just for that extra comfort. Honestly, the second I picked up the 405V, it felt like it was designed for my hand. It felt like they'd taken a mold out of my hand and everything just sit perfectly in place. And with the extra width of the 405V as opposed to normal vertical consoles, it means your hands are not so much like this, but more like that, as if you would be with a traditional controller. One thing for me personally that I might change, however, is the thumbstick placement. I prefer my thumbsticks in a staggered layout for retro gaming handhelds, because most of my gaming is around PlayStation 1 and onwards, where I want to use the left thumbstick a lot. I understand for some people that want to use the D-pad predominantly, then not having a staggered thumbstick layout is better, but honestly, if you're going for a console with as much power as a 405V, you're probably going to be doing a hefty amount of gaming that's going to use that left analog stick. And I would have liked to seen the left analog stick above the D-pad, but in all honesty, that's a small preference because the 405V is just incredibly comfortable to use with whatever games I've played on it. Now, there are some downsides in my eyes of the 405V compared to the 405M, and those are inherent to vertical console design, or more specifically modern vertical console design. Because the 405V is so ergonomic with its shoulders and it's so comfortable to use, it means it's a little bit bumpier and chunkier than the 405M. The 405M is a very streamlined, almost slab-like console which just slides in your pocket with no issue whatsoever. But sometimes when the 405V is in your pocket, the thumbsticks or the shoulders can be a little bit bulky, and even at times has gotten caught in my pocket. If I was choosing solely between Pocketability, the 405M would definitely win. Something else to consider as well is that if you want to play your 405V lying down in bed, be prepared that because it's a vertical console, it's kind of top heavy. And I'm not gonna lie, I was caught out one time when I was playing in bed, lying there, and because it's a bit top heavy, it flipped and landed on my face. That wouldn't have happened with the 405M. Maybe it's just me and I'm stupid. Something to consider though. Other than these small differences, and like we said, the 405V being a plastic shell and the 405M being a metallic shell, the consoles are identical in terms of power and user experience. And that even goes with some of the issues, like the screen sharpening effect that a lot of people have noticed in the 405M is also present on the 405V. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later and we will address it. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you're trying to pick between these consoles based on power, there is no difference other than battery life. It has to be purely around ergonomics and how you want to feel when playing your console. Emulation on the 405V, like the 405M, is absolutely amazing all the way up to PlayStation 1, PSP, Dreamcast and N64 emulation. And we can even get a serious amount of GameCube emulation on this console as well. PS2 is also available, but this is where we start to see a bit more of limitation. And whereas we do see some frame rate drops in GameCube emulation, you're going to see a lot more in PS2 emulation, and you'll have to play around a lot more with settings to get those 60 FPS. Wii emulation is also offered, but very limited, and to be honest, never anything I really indulge in on these kinds of consoles. Now, one of my favorite things about Anbernic consoles is always how easy they are to use. But as Anbernic have moved towards Android and stepped away from some of the Linux OSs that we've seen, the consoles are maybe not as pick up and play friendly as they have been, but they are as easy to use as any Android device. And for anybody that is comfortable using Android devices, Android options are better in my eyes because they give you a lot more flexibility. They allow you to connect to the internet, download new games, emulators, and overall are just a better user experience. But as we mentioned earlier, Anbernic put some screen sharpening on their Android OSs, which create a bit of a ghosting effect that I've never really liked, and was the primary reason why I would always use my Retroid Pocket 3 Plus over my RG405M. Even though everything else about the 405M I preferred, that screen sharpening was just too much for me. Like we said, the same applies on the RG405V, and if it's not an issue for you, it's not an issue, but if it is, there is a fix. And if you are getting a 405V, I thoroughly recommend you look into installing Gamma OS, because this fixes the screen sharpening issue and adds in a load of other fixes, but most importantly, takes your PS2 and GameCube emulation to another level. Games that are hovering around maybe the 40 to 50 FPS, for example Extreme G3 on the GameCube, were banging out 60 FPS no problem. And honestly, for a relatively simple and easy installation, it is definitely worth the difference. But even without making those changes, the RG405V is an absolutely exceptional console. It is so unique, it oozes charm, and it is an absolute pleasure to use. And like I say, to put it into context, ever since the Game Boy DMG, ever since that console, I've always been a landscape handheld console kind of guy. But the 405V now might change my mind. And honestly, the 405V is one of the most refreshing and exciting retro gaming handhelds I've used in the past couple of years. If you do want to get your hands on one, links will be in the description below. But if you really can't get into a vertical console, then check out the 405M.